The wind slid down the mountain like a hymn, carrying the resin of pine and the faint smell of smoke. Jonas Hale followed it into the hollow, where a cabin slouched against its own shadow. He had lived too long with only the creak of trees for company, his beard grown thick as the bark, his hands lined with years of silence. But something in that weak trail of smoke, in the sound of coughing that rode on the air, pulled him down from the ridges where he usually kept to himself. He stopped a few yards away, boots sinking in the damp earth. A child appeared in the doorway, barefoot, her dress ragged at the hem, her eyes older than her small body should have allowed. She held a boy at her side, his thumb in his mouth, staring at the stranger with solemn wonder. The girl's voice shook but carried a sharp edge, like she had already learned not to trust. "Are you here to hurt our mama too? She's dying." Jonas had been called many things in his life, drifter, hermit, broken man, but never had words cut so quick. He did not move closer. He only removed his hat, lowering it against his chest, and let the shame of the world that had already hurt them speak louder than anything he could have said. Inside, the air was heavy with sickness. The woman on the bed, Maggie Calloway, he later learned, was no more than mid-30s, but fever had thinned her face to bone and shadow. She coughed until flecks of red stained the cloth at her lips, then whispered apologies to her children before slipping into unconsciousness. The little boy clung to her arm, crying softly. Jonas stood there in the doorway, his heart remembering another bedside, another frail body he couldn't save, his wife, buried beneath a pine tree higher up the ridge. He could have turned back. It would have been easier, cleaner, the way of a man who had long given up the world. But the girl's eyes, half defiant and half pleading, rooted him there. He set down his pack and moved with a clumsy tenderness, fetching water, tearing strips from his own shirt to cool Maggie's forehead. The girl, Clara May, watched him without blinking. Her voice, low and wary, pressed against him like a blade. Men always leave. Jonas didn't answer. Words had never been his trade. Instead, he went outside, split logs until his shoulders burned, and set a fire that warmed the cabin through the night. His silence was his oath. Days bled together. He carried buckets of water from the creek, cooked beans until they softened, and taught Eli, the boy, how to whittle small birds out of cedar scraps. The children didn't laugh, not yet, but they began to hover near him, their suspicion thinning like mist in morning sun. The town, though, was less forgiving. Riders passed along the road, slowing to glance at the smoke curling from the Calloway cabin. Jonas heard the whispers carried on the wind. The mountain hermits moved in with the widow. Sin makes easy work of the weak. Shame washed over him, not for what he'd done, but for the cruelty of voices that had once cut him the same way. Maggie stirred more often, her fever a tide that rose and fell. When her eyes opened, she would whisper thanks, her voice cracked but sincere. Jonas only nodded, though his hands kept mending, fixing the door hinge, patching the quilt with his rough stitching. She looked at him like a man half in shadow, half in light, unsure which side he belonged to. One evening a storm swelled over the mountains, rain beating the roof like fists. Maggie's cough deepened, her body shaking under the threadbare blanket. Jonas sat by her bed, the children curled against him for warmth. Clara May, so guarded before, finally reached out and clutched his sleeve. Her small hand trembled, but she didn't let go. Jonas stared at the woman struggling for breath, at the children pressed against him, and felt something he had buried with his wife, the weight of belonging. As dawn broke beyond the storm, painting the cabin in pale gold, he knew he had crossed an unseen threshold. He had come down the mountain as a man apart, but now the question lingered in his chest like a wound. Would this fragile bond be strong enough to survive the judgment of the town, Maggie's failing body, and the ghosts of his own grief? The days that followed carried the weight of whispers. Jonas could feel them even when the wind was still. Word had spread down in town. Old Mrs. Harrow, the preacher's wife, had seen him outside the Calloway place splitting wood, and by supper time the story had grown teeth. The hermit's taken up with the widow, they said, living in sin. Jonas walked the dirt street a week later, hat low, the list of what Maggie needed folded in his hand. He asked for quinine, for flour, for clean bandages. The shopkeeper narrowed his eyes, spat in the sawdust, and said the medicine was out of stock. Jonas saw the bottles lined up behind him. Pride and anger pressed hot against his ribs, but he only nodded, laid down coin for flour, and left with his shame heavier than the sack he carried. That night, Maggie's fever raged again. Her skin burned under his palm, and her breaths came like brittle reeds snapping in wind. Jonas sat beside her, sweat rolling down his temples, whispering prayers he hadn't spoken since the day he lowered his wife into Mountain Earth. Maggie's voice broke through the fever once, thin as paper. Asterisk, I don't want to be a burden. Just love my children. Don't let them go alone. Asterisk. Jonas bent his head, his voice rougher than gravel. I ain't much for words, Maggie, but I won't leave Em. It was the closest he'd come to a vow since his own family was taken. In the days that followed, something unspoken grew between them. When she had strength, Maggie stitched his torn sleeve, her hands lingering on the fabric as if mending him along with the cloth. When he cooled her forehead, brushing hair from her face, her eyes held his for longer than was proper. There were no declarations, no easy promises. Only gestures, small, quiet, steady, that built something stronger than either of them expected. The children began calling him Mr. Jonas without being told. Clara May's voice softened when she spoke to him, the suspicion drained from it. Eli followed him everywhere, carrying scraps of cedar wood, eager to carve. Jonas found himself speaking more to the boy than he had spoken to anyone in years. The cabin, once an echoing hollow, began to sound like life again. But sickness is a stubborn enemy. One storm-heavy night, Maggie collapsed while stirring a pot, her body folding like a reed. Jonas caught her before she struck the floor, his heart pounding harder than the thunder outside. He knew she would not survive without real help. He saddled his horse and rode through rain so fierce it blinded him. The town doctor, Avery, opened his door, lantern lights spilling into the storm. Jonas begged him, voice breaking, but the man only shook his head. Not worth the trouble. She's half gone already. You'll waste your time. Something in Jonas broke then, not just for Maggie, but for every cruel word and turned back he had endured since he came down from mountains. His voice, usually quiet, thundered louder than the storm. Cowards, a lot of you, hiding behind gossip while a woman dies. You're not fit to call yourselves neighbors. He left the doctor standing in his doorway, spurred his horse through mud and lightning, and returned to the cabin with nothing but his own will to fight for her life. Through the night he sat at her side, her hand trapped in his, whispering prayers and fragments of memory, begging her to stay. Clara May curled against his arm, her eyes wide but dry, as though she knew her mother's fate balanced on the weight of this man's presence. Dawn crept in, pale and trembling. Maggie stirred. Her fever, though not gone, had broken. Her lips parted, breath steady, and her eyes opened, weak but alive. She tried to speak, but Jonas only hushed her, a rare smile bending his weathered face. A week later, Maggie found her strength enough to walk into town. She held Clara May's hand in one palm and Eli's in the other, Jonas a silent tower at her side. Heads turned. Whispers rippled. There they are. She should have died. He brought her back. But dignity shone brighter than judgment. Maggie's back was straight, her face pale but proud. Jonas walked beside her, not speaking, yet his presence alone silenced more tongues than anger ever could. They bought flour, bandages, a small sack of sugar, together, as a family not broken but whole. The preacher's wife stared from her window, but Maggie did not flinch. Clara May squeezed Jonas's hand, her eyes glimmering with something like joy. That evening, back at the cabin, the air smelled of wood smoke and bread. Maggie sat at the table, hands folded over Jonas's rough ones. No words were spoken, but her touch told the whole story, gratitude, trust, and the fragile start of something like love. Clara May, watching from the hearth, whispered with a shy smile, "Mama, he didn't hurt us, he saved us." Jonas lifted his gaze to the horizon beyond the cabin window. For years, he had thought belonging was something buried under the pines with his wife and child. Yet now, with Maggie's hand resting on his, the children's laughter trembling in the air, he felt it stir again. Not as a memory, but as a life waiting to be lived. Astor's friend, maybe you've known the weight of judgment too. Maybe you've wondered if your kindness was enough, if your silence had value. But sometimes it's the smallest acts, the water fetched in the night, the storm ridden through, the hand held steady, that changed the shape of a life. The lonely mountain man found his way back not through words, but through love lived quietly. And maybe, just maybe, that same quiet grace waits for you too. Asterisk.